Welcome everyone to the 42nd Virtual Roundtable on Measuring Corruption. I am your host, Joseph Pochgay Alvarez, and I'm delighted to be joined today by James Bolton-Jones, who is a member of Spotlight on Corruption. I'm very excited about learning and listening about the new project that they launched, very much related to quantifying the incidence of corruption and other uh, financial crimes in the UK. So this conversation will be very country specific, but I think that there's a lot that we can learn about how it could potentially look like based on data availability in other parts of the world. Um, I'm very much looking forward to it, and as well about learning of the activities that Spotlight on Corruption had been conducting in the recent past. Spotlight on Corruption has become a very prominent organization, and so I'm delighted to be able to hold them today. Thank you, everyone, of course, as well for joining today. Before I cede the floor to James, I would like just to remind everyone to please keep your microphone muted during the presentation, unless you have any questions or comments to share. So you don't have to wait until the end of James' presentation if you would like to make a comment or question concerning anything that we're discussing at the moment or anything that you're seeing on the slides here on the screen. Please don't feel shy. Just raise your hand or click the icon there, and I'll invite you to unmute yourself. The first time that you do so, I would be more than happy you could very briefly introduce yourself so that both James and I know what is your affiliation and what connects you to the discussion that we're having today. All right, so that's it from my side for now. And without wasting any more of your time, James, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Joseph, and great to see all of you. I don't think I know anybody on the call, so it's great to see lots of new faces. I'm just gonna share my screen and hope that it works. Let's see. Um, so if I go there, can you now see my presentation? Great. Okay, let me go to the first slide. Okay, so um, as Joseph mentioned, my name is James Bolton-Jones. I'm a senior policy researcher at Spotlight on Corruption, and I will talk about who I am a bit more and what we do a bit more at the start of the presentation. But the main thing I'm here to talk about is our new anti-corruption enforcement tracker, which we launched around a month and a half ago, I would say. So it's fairly new, and we're really keen to receive lots of feedback and thoughts on how we can improve it. So just in terms of the structure of the presentation, just going to firstly talk about what Spotlight on Corruption is, what we do, why we exist, and I'm going to cover a few case studies to kind of articulate that. Then I'm going to talk about the enforcement tracker itself and how that fits in with our wider work. Then talk about a bit more about what the tracker actually visualizes, what data is it showing, and then some of the methodology that we used to create it, and some of the challenges that we encountered along the way, of which there were quite a few. And then that's okay. So that's the presentation. So first of all, and I would just say as well, as Joseph said, but just to emphasize, if anyone has any questions throughout the presentation, please just jump in and ask, because I don't really want to just drone on at you for ages. That might be a bit boring. So any questions, please just jump in, and don't be shy, as Joseph said. So yeah, first of all, a bit about Spotlight on Corruption and myself. So as I mentioned, my name's James. I've worked at Spotlight for 3.5 years or so in various roles, both kind of in communications and then parliamentary advocacy, trying to promote and advocate for our work in the UK Parliament. And now I work more on sort of our policy and research. Before working at Spotlight on Corruption, I was doing my master's in Russian and post-Soviet politics. And before that, I worked quite briefly in investigations and in due diligence in London in the private sector, which gave me sort of some quite good insight into the role that the UK and particularly London can play in enabling grand corruption and kleptocracy using complex corporate structures, for example, to hide stolen funds from all over the world, and the use of, for example, the UK courts to defend the wealth and reputations of kleptocrats. And then here I've got a picture of the Spotlight team. So there I am, but also our director, Dr. Susan Hawley, Helen, Alex, and Catherine. So we're quite a small team. We are expanding a little bit over the next few months to, I think, 2 more people. So we'll be 7. So still pretty small, but we like to think that we have quite an outsized impact despite our size. So what do we do? Here's just a kind of brief summary of our mission statement. So our real focus is on the enforcement of the UK's anti-corruption laws. So we're talking the Bribery Act, our anti-money laundering regulations, the Proceeds of Crime Act. I don't know the main sort of law in the UK for recovering dirty money. And we also look at kind of domestic political standards in the UK as well, although that's not so much the focus of the enforcement tracker. But it's worth highlighting that the UK is as a major financial centre, and also with its overseas territories and crown dependencies, it is a very popular destination for those who are looking to launder their dirty money, as I'm sure most of you, or maybe all of you know. There isn't an official kind of no one really knows in terms of when we're talking about measuring corruption. No one really knows how much money is laundered through the UK, but the National Crime Agency, which is the main one of probably the main and the largest law enforcement agency that looks at enforcing our anti-corruption laws, alongside the police and the Serious Fraud Office, as well as HMRC. But the NCA estimates that there is a realistic possibility that the scale of money laundering impacting the UK is in the hundreds of billions of pounds annually. So that is a lot of laundered funds that either are coming into the UK and staying there, or passing through UK corporate structures. So it's a serious problem, and the UK parts of the UK system are trying hard to address it, but perhaps not hard enough, and not with enough support from the kind of highest levels of political leadership. So what do? We researched this problem, and we monitor the enforcement of the UK's anti-corruption laws, specifically through a court monitoring program. So one of my colleagues who was up on the screen earlier, Helen, is often down in the courts in London, monitoring key cases. So an interesting one that she was monitoring recently was on the prosecution of Glencore, the big commodities giant that was convicted of bribery about 2 or 3 years ago. So that was a really interesting case. And we basically, through that work, we learn how the laws are being used in practice, whether they're working, and whether the agencies that are tasked with enforcing them are well resourced enough to do that work effectively. And then we communicate our findings to key stakeholders in the UK Parliament and government, regulators, in an effort to secure more resources for these law enforcement agencies and ensure that the laws are as strong and effective as possible. And one of our key aims is to kind of stop address the problem of lots of the law enforcement agencies currently being very under-resourced. But Joseph, I see you've got your hand up. You're acting upon my plea to please interject when you have a question. So thank you very much for doing that. What would you like to ask?
Thank you, James, and I'm sorry for interrupting so early in your presentation.
No, not at all.
And
Please,
to
it's very
anyone as
welcome.
well. So I wanted to ask you about this specific point of monitoring court cases, right? Which I find to be very interesting. because it's both very relevant, right? But I guess because of, I come from academia, a lot of of our colleagues here present are also from academia. So we often tend to be at least one or two steps behind, so not engaging that directly with this type of situations. So I was wondering if basic I don't know if I should call it the rationale or the motivation for doing that is to be able to monitor the enforcement of criminal laws and other forms of legislation, or also because, of course, court cases set precedent for the future. If there is kind of like a policy angle to be able to estimate what is the direction that certain policies are going down. Could you say something about this?
Yeah, for sure. And in fact, and I probably would add another point. So we don't always just monitor the court cases. Sometimes, if there is a specific reason to, we will also engage in strategic litigation where we'll try and intervene in a court case. A really good example of that, which kind of covers your question as well, was last year the World Uyghur Congress, which is an organization that campaigns for the rights of the Uyghur people in Xinjiang, took a case against the National Crime Agency because the NCA had refused to investigate their claims that cotton from Xinjiang province had been made through forced labor and slave labor, and was therefore the proceeds of crime. And the NCA said it's impossible to investigate because it would transform the landscape for these kinds of materials coming out of that part of China. And we intervened to ensure that the Proceeds of Crime Act that was sort of being discussed in the court case was not severely watered down, because if the NCA had been found to have been in the right in refusing to investigate, then that would have meant that POCA, as we call it, would have been far weaker and would have been really undermined for the future because of how the law works. So we sort of intervened and successfully ensured that the NCA was found that it was not correct in its decision to not investigate that issue. So it's kind of all of the above. So we're looking at how the laws are implemented, how sort of policies around the laws are working. So just because there's a law doesn't necessarily mean it's actually going to be enforced if there's no policies or resourcing for that law to actually have any teeth. If that makes sense.
No, absolutely great. So if I understand correctly, I'm getting that there's a significant, let's say, goal to have a policy impact, over the legal landscape in the UK. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yeah. And in fact, I will, when I come to my case studies, one of my case studies will talk in a bit more detail about the policy impact of of something that emerged from our court monitoring. So I will come to that quite shortly, which should hopefully be of interest.
Fabulous. Thank you.
Great. And also, yeah, please others do jump in if you have any other questions. So here we go. Yeah, some case studies. So these are just some snapshots from our reports that we've done, calling for more resourcing for key agencies. So the one on the left is one we did last year, where the report was entitled, "Is Britain's FBI on its knees?" It was a bit cheeky because the FBI and the NCA are quite different, but it was we used that framing to try and get political attention on the issue, which we successfully did. We had a headline front page in the Times newspaper, which is one of the biggest newspapers in the UK. It was in the Daily Mail as well, which is pretty widely read by politicians, and led to we're kind of waiting to see what the settlement for the NCA will be next week, actually, because we have our big spending review, which is where the government will set out the budgets for different government departments for the next 2 to 3 years. So we'll see how that goes. But hopefully we'll have played a small role in the NCA, at least having the same resources, if not more, but hopefully not fewer than before. And then another report on the far right was one that we did in 2022, where we looked at the kind of overall cost of economic crime, including corruption and money laundering, bribery, fraud, to the UK, and how that compared to the resourcing of the agencies that were tasked with fighting that crime. And the disparity was pretty stark. But I see, is it David or Sotola has a question? Would you like to come in?
Yes, yes. Thank you very much for the presentation. I just want some form of clarity around how the anti-corruption law enforcement system is set up in the UK. You've mentioned the National Crime Agency. I also want to know how the roles relate, or is there an interface between National Crime Agency and the serious fraud unit, and the anti-corruption SAR. So I just wanted to explain that briefly for me. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So very briefly, there is the National Crime Agency, which is a really big agency, and it looks at lots of different problems, serious organized crime in particular. Within the National Crime Agency, we have the National Economic Crime Centre, which is a coordinating body for all of the different agencies in the UK that work on economic crime slash corruption. Those include some agencies within the NCA itself. So those are the International Corruption Unit, Anti-Corruption Unit, which is a small body that looks at corruption where there's a UK nexus in developing countries that receive aid funds from the UK government. There's also the Financial Intelligence Unit in the NCA, which receives suspicious activity reports from the regulated sector and processes those and analyzes them and sends them off to relevant law enforcement agencies. And then, as you mentioned, there is the Serious Fraud Office, which is a fairly small organization compared to the NCA. So it has a budget of around 90 million, whereas the NCA's budget is more like 800 million a year. And the SFO looks specifically at the most serious and complex fraud and bribery and corruption cases, but it doesn't actually have that many cases ongoing at any one time because of the complexity of those cases. So it has, I think its caseload currently, it has around 24 cases that are open, if I recall correctly. We also have HMRC, which is His Majesty's Revenue and Customs, which looks at things like tax evasion. That's a massive agency, that is tasked with collecting taxes. So that's just a small part of its work. Then there's, when it comes to anti-money laundering, there are lots of different professional bodies that supervise the legal and accountancy sectors, 22 overall, that supervise those sectors for their compliance with the anti-money laundering regulations. You're probably getting the impression that it's quite a complicated picture because it is.
Yeah, because I just want to know whether the NCA is works more like the FBI kind of a system, or the Serious Fraud Office is like a unit within the NCA, or is a separate autonomous kind of arrangement.
So the SFO is entirely separate from the NCA. It will have an officer or someone in the National Economic Crime Centre, which is the coordinating body within the NCA, kind of just in order to help coordinate the different law enforcement activities relating to economic crime in the UK. But the SFO is entirely separate, and the NCA, it is very, very broadly equivalent to the FBI, but it's not. The FBI covers a far larger country. And it's much bigger. Whereas the NCA, it does cover the whole of the UK, but it's far smaller and kind of has fewer capabilities. So the comparison is not that accurate, but it's useful for kind of getting political attention, which is how policy change happens.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for the question. It is definitely confusing. I didn't even mention the Financial Conduct Authority, which covers financial crime as it relates to the banking and broader financial sector. But anyway, I will move on. Another case study. This is the one that I had mentioned to you, Joseph, was on how we successfully had a campaign to introduce a fairly small but quite significant change to the asset recovery regime in the UK. So previously, we learned from our court monitoring program that the agencies like the SFO and the NCA, when they went up against really, really well-resourced defendants in cases where they were trying to recover suspected proceeds of crime on the basis of civil recovery, civil forfeiture. So that's different to a criminal case. It's where you just have to prove things on the balance of probabilities that the funds are the proceeds of crime. If the agencies lost that case, they would be on the hook for huge bills that would kind of, in one case, it was like half of the budget for an agency for that year. So they were just being massively dissuaded from actually engaging in these cases. So we campaigned for a new regime, a change to that law, whereby as long as the agency conducted itself reasonably and properly, then it wouldn't be liable for those huge costs. Those costs would be borne by the defendant. And that law hasn't been introduced yet. It's currently before Parliament in a bill, so we're hoping that it will make it through. But we think that should have and I put the clause in the Crime and Policing Act, which is currently before Parliament there. But that's quite a specific example of where we've seen something in the courts, and we've then campaigned to have a law changed, and touch wood, which is fingers crossed that makes it through Parliament. So we will see. So next, I will move on to the enforcement tracker. What are the aims? So the enforcement tracker is aiming to increase public understanding of how the UK is doing when it comes to enforcing against corruption and other related economic crimes, which is kind of part of our focus at looking at how well these agencies are resourced, how well they are performing. There have been some other attempts to do this kind of thing, visualize enforcement outcomes, but not that we've seen, at least. And if anyone on the call is aware of any examples in the UK or elsewhere, please let me know. I'd be very interested. I think, was that Beatrice? Did I see your hand pop up?
Yes, James, but I'm sorry, I wanted to ask you a question, but regarding the campaign you just mentioned.
Yeah, go for it.
I'm really sorry. I just wanted to know my name is Beatriz Aguedo. I'm a PhD student here in Kyoto University, researching about integrity and compliance. And regarding the campaign that you just mentioned and your case study, I wanted to know, what was the main strategy to position yourselves into the public arena to actually make to be taken into account to be able to make this law change?
Yeah, that's a great question. And at the time, I was working primarily in a role that engaged the UK Parliament, so I was very involved in that campaign. There are in any kind of advocacy campaign, there are quite a lot of different elements to it, but I would say the main ones are media strategy and political strategy and research. So we did research into the problem and really understood and expressed why the problem was so serious. And that was through desk research, through talking to people on the front line in law enforcement who were experiencing these problems. Then we also had to take on the Ministry of Justice, their objections to how the law, what our suggestions, the implications of our suggestions, which they said would fundamentally change the legal principle of the loser pays in the UK. We then went and found loads of examples in the UK where that's not the case, and there were basically lots of exceptions. They were sort of trying to say that it was some hallowed legal principle that had never been violated, but actually it wasn't the case at all from the research. And then we had a political strategy. So there was a bill before Parliament at the time that we worked with parliamentarians who we worked with previously to table amendments to that bill, which then were rejected by the government continually throughout the process of the bill going through Parliament until the very end, where the government conceded and they didn't accept the amendment entirely, but they accepted an amendment that would require a report to be to be done on our suggestion and a consultation, which we then fed into a few months later. Made the same arguments again, and then eventually about a few months ago, it was announced that this measure would be included in this new piece of legislation that was coming before Parliament. So that was kind of and then we also at the same time were trying to get articles in the media, op-eds from senior politicians to kind of shape that public narrative. But yeah, Alice, did you have a further question? Go for it.
Yes, it's just a follow-up question regarding what you are just discussed. Just briefly introduce myself. I'm an HFB and I'm working currently on a project that it's called Respond for the University of Bologna, and in which we are studying political corruption and also undue form of influence in Italy and UK. And so this is why I'm interested in Spotlight, broadly speaking. But I have a specific question. You were describing, I would say, the strategies that you are using to push a bit the actors in the policy arena. My question is, when you are acting in this way, you are just like Spotlight on corruption, or sometimes also you are acting as a member of the UK Anti-Corruption Coalition, just to understand whether, yes, if you are acting like the main actor or in conjunction with others that are working on anti-corruption in the UK landscape from the grassroots perspective. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Alice. And I should have said, actually, we often work very closely in partnership with other organisations. And I'm impressed that you know about the UK Anti-Corruption Coalition. So that's a civil society coalition, including Spotlight, Transparency International UK, the Open Contracting Partnership, and lots of others. You can look us up on the internet. We have a website. And in this case, it was a question, for example, on the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Bill, now Act, that I mentioned. That was a question of working in close partnership with lots of other civil society organisations. But in general, we would kind of mutually support each other, but there would be a specific issue perhaps that one organisation would take a lead on. So for example, for this measure, cost protection, Spotlight were kind of taking the lead, but on other measures, for example, on a reform to Companies House, which is the corporate registry in the UK, that it used to be an absolute mess and it's now been reformed and it is a bit better, but it's still encountering issues. That was something that Transparency International UK really led the work on. So it was kind of, we would choose, depending on our expertise and our interests, like particular issues that we would champion, but would still very much like mutually reinforce each other. Hopefully that answered the question. Very quickly, kind of quick look at other indexes and measurement tools. So people might be familiar with some of these. There's the Basel Anti-Money Laundering Index. That kind of doesn't really look at enforcement. It looks at how different countries have been judged by various different reports. So the Basel one takes into account, for example, Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index and Financial Action Task Force reports. But it's not really focused on enforcement. The other three do have more of a focus on enforcement. So that's the Transparency International Exporting Corruption report, which looks at how many anti-corruption / bribery, bribery in particular cases a country has engaged in that year, the kind of the nature of those cases, how kind of major they are, and then compares that to the kind of size of the economy. So that's quite an interesting version. And then the other two that I've listed are one done by the Mintz Group and Stanford Law School on kind of the FCPA, which is the the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the US, and the enforcement of that particular law. And they're actually really, I should probably maybe if I think I have a link here. Yeah, is that coming up? Maybe. Here we go. Can you see my screen still? Let's see if it comes up. Well, maybe the internet's not cooperating. Oh, here we go. So I think, can you see my screen? Yeah, great. So this is the index here. It's quite interesting. Like, kind of looks at how many FCPA actions there have been in relation to different countries. So China has the most, then Brazil, etc. But it's just on one single law, rather than our tracker, which looks at a range of different laws, although it is just focused on the UK. And I will see if I can seamlessly reopen my presentation. And the Minsk group is a similar concept. So it looks at FCPA enforcement. A few caveats before I sort of get into the tracker discussion, which, as everyone on the call will be more than aware, corruption is very hard to define. So in terms of what corruption we're actually looking at in the tracker, it's a flawed definition, and there are lots of gaps. So in terms of enforcement in the UK, our Office for National Statistics only classes corruption as bribery and misconduct in public office, which is kind of the UK's domestic anti-corruption law for public office holders. But the UK government, in a recent development, has, as part of its upcoming new anti-corruption strategy, it has a new definition, which is a lot broader. So it's the abuse of entrusted power for private benefit that usually breaches laws, regulations, standards of integrity, and or standards of professional behavior, and adds that corruption need not be economic in nature and can still exist even if everyone has acted within the law, which is a pretty good definition, I think, but it is very broad. And obviously this tracker does not capture a lot of the corruption that is in that definition. So yeah, a couple of caveats. So now I will talk through the tracker a bit. And again, yeah, please do jump in if there are any questions, because it's probably maybe a bit esoteric and quite UK focused. But it looks at prosecution and conviction data, money laundering offences, fraud offences, bribery offences, and misconduct in office offences, asset recovery data, confiscation orders, various kinds of forfeiture orders, and then asset recovery related to the grand corruption, and then AML, anti-money laundering, fine data. So that is everything that it looks at. The sources are all public sources from the UK government. So we haven't done any kind of independent research into different offences. We've just kind of drawn directly from the official sources, which is useful in that it kind of means that the data is pretty robust, but it also, as I will explain later, has some issues. So just to kind of briefly talk about the different offences and whatnot in the tracker. And actually, I think it might be worth just putting a link to the tracker in the chat. So if people want to kind of have a look at it while we go, how do I do this? Actually, Joseph, would you mind doing that if you have a moment?
Absolutely, I'll do it right now.
Thank you very much. Okay, so where is my presentation gone? Yeah, we've got money laundering offences. So people on the call might say, but money laundering isn't necessarily corruption, and you would be totally right. It can basically be any acquisitive crime. So it is very much not just limited to corruption. It's a much more holistic view of how the UK is faring when it comes to prosecuting money laundering, which can cover the proceeds of corruption, but obviously can cover lots and lots of other offences. And in the UK, I think particularly the two highest offences that are predicate crimes for money laundering are drugs offences and fraud. So it's not necessarily going to be corruption, but it gives kind of a good impression, I would say, of kind of the overall ability of the UK to prosecute against money laundering, which would factor into kind of the ability to deal with the proceeds of corruption. Fraud, again, people would say possibly, fraud, that's not corruption. And again, there are obviously big differences, but I would also argue quite a lot of crossover. So in the tracker, we've only included, we've included a big overall stat of all the fraud offences that were recorded in the UK, which is 88 different offences. And this is a huge range. So it can range from kind of big corporate fraud to fraud against the government when people try and claim benefits from the government fraudulently. So it's a big range, but it's just to kind of give that overall indication of where the enforcement picture is at. And then we look at some specific offences where we would argue that there is quite a lot of crossover. So conspiracy to defraud, corrupt transactions with agents is another offence. So yeah, where there's kind of that crossover. Bribery offences, now this is more kind of squarely in the corruption space, I think. But there is some difficulty. I've kind of got a list of challenges later, but I'll cover one now quickly, which is that we encountered in our research that one of the offences in the UK Bribery Act, which is bribery of foreign public officials, was actually each offence in the data has a special code, and the code for bribery of foreign public officials was something like 099909. And what happened was prosecutors and the people recording the offence type in the courts had just used this offence code as a miscellaneous code for several years. So up until 2017, it appeared that there were loads and loads of prosecutions for bribery of foreign public officials, which to begin with, when we were looking at the data, we were really shocked because we've never actually encountered any prosecutions under this offence. But then we looked into it a bit more, and there was a caveat in the notes, very deep in the Excel spreadsheet, that this had been used as a miscellaneous code, and that from 2018 they'd addressed this, so it was no longer the case. But yeah, it was kind of an interesting insight into the risks of just relying blindly on data without kind of looking at the background. And then, as I mentioned, misconduct in public office is the closest thing the UK has to a domestic corruption offence, but it is pretty flawed. So we've analysed kind of different cases that have been brought under this offence, and the vast majority relate to really junior employees of the prison or the police service, and often they relate to inappropriate relations, so kind of sexual misconduct, which can certainly be a form of corruption, sextortion, I suppose, but it's not really being used to prosecute a wide variety of what you might sort of see as classic corruption cases. So there is a campaign ongoing to try and reform that law on the basis of that research. But Joseph, I see you've got a question. Please jump in.
Yes, thank you. I have a couple of questions. So the first one is about the collection of data related to money laundering. So you were describing it in terms of number of cases. So I wonder if the information about the amount of money that was laundered is available as well when you're collecting data. And if you also, well, I believe in the tracker just described in terms of number of cases. So I wonder why not also kind of either color coding them or measuring them based on the size of it, because I imagine the cases may be very heterogeneous, right? From a couple of 100,000 of pounds to many millions. So is that something that you encounter in the data, and how do you deal with those differences?
That's actually a really interesting question, because the data does not indicate the amount of money that was laundered in that particular case. There is asset recovery data, which
Right.
does show asset recovery, which can often the predicate crime that's not really how it works, but the assets can be recovered on the basis of money laundering. And there is data on that, but it's not attached to the prosecution data. And actually the prosecution data does show the sentence length, but interestingly, the sentence in the UK, sentences for money laundering don't take into account, they only take into account the amount of money laundered. They don't take into account the actual harm that occurred as a result of that money laundering, which is, so it's the data is potentially better than other jurisdictions. I don't know. I'd be really interested to hear if others on the call have any experience with other jurisdictions is kind of data on prosecution and conviction data on crimes like money laundering, but it is limited. So you don't get the kind of that sort of data attached to it, which is unfortunate.
That is very unfortunate indeed. I imagine that to a degree it's difficult sometimes to estimate, to put a specific number in terms of assets laundered, especially when a lot of the assets are not financial in nature, at least not originally, right? We have, of course, art and jewelry and other financial vehicles used to launder assets. but I find that very interesting and quite unfortunate indeed, because two cases might be completely different, right?
Yeah.
The other question that I had was about the British context in terms of uh, how these charges are brought up, right? In terms of prosecutorial strategy. So I believe the first time that we had a Zoom call, I mentioned how in Peru most corruption cases that are brought up, and very recently one of our former presidents in Peru was convicted for corruption. Or at least the headlines presented it as being convicted of corruption, right? But when you look at the court case, actually the individual was convicted of money laundering, right? Because it has become a quite common strategy for prosecutors to bring charges for money laundering, because it's easier to make the case of that rather than prove that the criminal nature, the criminal source of the assets themselves, right? So it's either money laundering or heading a criminal organization. That is a common criminal figure that is used in court cases as well. Now, I mentioned this because we seem to have a lot of cases of money laundering, right, in the tracker, but relatively speaking, only a handful of bribery offenses. So I wonder if this is because of the prosecutorial strategy, or this is, I don't know. I would love to hear your interpretation of this.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm not aware of loads of cases where money laundering has been used as a kind of proxy for an anti-corruption offense, but there definitely have been some. Like, for example, there was one relating to the Azerbaijani laundromat, which, if people aren't familiar with that, that was, yeah, lots of money coming out of Azerbaijan illicitly and going into various jurisdictions, including the UK. And a small amount of that broad, I think it was billions, were coming out, but a few million was recovered in the UK courts on the basis of a civil recovery case. And I think that was a money laundering case, but I would have to double check off the top of my head. But yeah, it's definitely not something that you see loads and loads. Definitely would like to see more kind of grand corruption cases prosecuted in the UK. And if that was done on the basis of a money laundering offence, that would be great. There is, I will come to it in a minute, but there is an interesting thing the UK government started doing recently, which is they've started collecting asset recovery data as it relates to grand corruption, which is really interesting, quite novel. But I will touch on that in a minute. But first of all, is Natalia, I think you've got a question.
Yes, thank you. First of all, very nice to meet you. I'm working at the OECD and Anti-Corruption Division, and this is really super important and interesting topic for us. I just wanted to ask about and maybe you will cover it in the presentation later, about the investigation stage, whether you considered to take that data into account as well, or it was very intentional not to cover and focus obviously on prosecution and conviction, which shows the enforcement much better than investigation. But sometimes in some of the countries, especially in the Eastern Europe, we see that the investigation takes a while, takes years, and then the statute of limitation hits. So everything is closed in the first stage and it doesn't get to the second, then finally to the third stage. So, but maybe it's a difference in the legal system too, which could be the response to this question. So broader question, do you consider investigation at all, or it's not covered, or you will be covering a bit later at the later stage? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. There is data on police charges. So if the police charge someone for a crime, there is a data set for that, which we could consider using. The reason we didn't, I guess two main reasons. The first one was that we were trying to get a national picture of all of the agencies that are involved in this kind of enforcement work, and that is only the police, which is quite, the police are a very important body when it comes to this kind of work, but when it comes to kind of grand corruption, kleptocracy, the police are unlikely to be involved. So it will be much more likely to be an agency like the NCA or the SFO. So there's no charging data for those agencies as far as we're aware. And the second reason was that I guess our view was the really important data is whether people are being prosecuted and whether they're being convicted. Obviously, it is really important if investigations are opened, because that has to happen first. But in terms of like prioritizing the data and not sort of overwhelming the users, that was another consideration. Great. Okay, I will move on. So yeah, the asset recovery data. So I've kind of run through these confiscation orders, forfeiture orders, and asset recovery related to grand corruption, as I mentioned. And then yes, so I will quickly touch on some of the trends in the tracker that people will have seen if you're having a look at it. But in terms of money laundering and fraud, so as you'll see, the kind of fraud picture is pretty bleak. It's gone down a lot over time, with a slight increase over the last year. Money laundering wise, if I got one for that, no. Money laundering, as Joseph was saying, there are quite a lot of cases. They've in general been going down when it comes to offences where money laundering is the most serious offence prosecuted. And I'll come to this because the statistics are counted in two different ways. Where it's a money laundering case that may not be the most serious case prosecuted, the decline is less steep. But there has been a bit of an uptick. In fact, maybe I think I'll stick to my presentation, and maybe you can look at the tracker at the same time on your screens. What was I saying? So money laundering, the prosecutions and convictions have increased a little bit in the last year, which is good news. I think this is probably because there has been a bit more of a focus on resourcing of some key agencies. Even if they haven't got loads more, they've got a little bit more resourcing. Bribery is much more fluctuating, as Joseph was saying, but it's never been that high. So hit a peak of 27 prosecutions in 2018/19, and then it was just back to 9 last year. And then misconduct in public office, again, really fluctuating. There's not really any kind of clear trend there, but it would be worth noting that the kind of overall enforcement response doesn't really seem adequate compared to the problem. So there's some data that would be probably interesting to share. From 2020, there was an economic crime survey where basically the government went out and interviewed lots of business people, and they estimated that there had been over 1 million corruption incidents over the 3 years up to 2020, including as many as 130,000 bribes offered to UK businesses. But when you compare the number of bribery prosecutions to that, it is pretty low. Oh, Joseph, I see you've got your hand up. Would you like to jump in?
Thank you. So this is a bit of a methodological question, and I was reminded of it when looking at the data for bribery, prosecution, and convictions. So in that one, so both are shown for the period 2023-2024, and we see more convictions than prosecutions, right? Which of course sounds counterintuitive. But of course, then we may think that, well, one is when the prosecution started, when the conviction took place, right? So I just wanted to ask you to clarify exactly how prosecutions are quantified here, and as belonging to one specific year. And then if you could say something about how this potential kind of difference in time between when the prosecution is counted as one belonging to a certain period and when the conviction take place, if there are any concerns or any questions about what that means when considering a historical pattern, right? Because, for example, in this case, we see both of them dropping around the same time, but again, there's a period, there's a distance between the prosecution and the conviction. So I would love it if you could clarify this a little bit.
That is a very good question. That was in one of my challenges later, so you preempted me. But no, great question. It's a tricky one because obviously a prosecution rarely takes a year, especially. I mean, I think there's an interesting series in the Financial Times at the moment about criminal justice systems, not just in the UK but across Europe, that are crumbling and really struggling to process cases, and it's very much the case in the UK, where there are, you know, massive court delays and backlogs, especially for complex economic crime cases, which take a bit longer and require kind of expertise and judges who know what they're talking about. So basically, prosecutions are very, very rarely going to happen in a single year, and result in a conviction, which means that you can't calculate annual conviction rates from the data, which is frustrating. We kind of wanted to, but it's not a credible thing to do in this case. In terms of how it's counted, the prosecution is counted from when it's first heard in court, and then and then the conviction is when that occurs. So yeah, there can be that lag. In terms of how that affects the data, I think if you were just looking at like 1 or 2 years, then that would be a serious problem, because it's you know, you might have loads of prosecutions started in, say, like 2015 that all happened to result in convictions by 2018. And if you were just looking at like 2 or 3 years, it would look quite weird and confusing. But I think looking over a longer time period, you kind of mitigate that risk, because you can see, oh, well, that, you know, there were lots of prosecutions started then, and now we see there are quite a few convictions in like 2 or 3 years, so that probably maps over. But it's not a perfect system by any means.
So I have a follow-up question to that one, and this is something that Beatriz will know exactly what I mean, because she and I have had this discussion in the past when looking at the situation in prosecution and convictions of political leaders in Peru over, you know, between the 2000s and 2010s. And one of the methodological challenges that we faced is, well, a lot of court cases, a lot of convictions are overturned later on, right? At the Court of Appeals or at some other stage, even the Supreme Court may get involved there. So I wonder if that data is available, if that is considered. I don't know the situation in UK, so I don't know how often does that happen either.
That's a really good question. I haven't really engaged with that risk, to be honest. That's definitely something we should look at. I would say the data is updated every quarter for the prosecution and convictions data by the Ministry of Justice. And I actually did it. I went through an update about 2 weeks ago for some of the latest money laundering data. And I did look back over the entire time period, and there were some small changes. So I updated according to the latest publication. But it may be that there were some small changes because of things like convictions that have been overturned. But the data didn't specify that. So that would probably be one for me to follow up with the Ministry of Justice, actually, because I don't think they currently make that clear.
Right. I mean, yeah. I would be curious then later on to see how that lands in your equation, because again, then that open question, so how that should be represented in this type of graph, right? Yeah, I didn't mean this as a criticism at all. It's just a challenge that I also struggled with in the past, and I don't think that I reach an answer either. So I'm curious to see how you guys solve that if you decide to tackle it.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely. I mean, it's still a fairly new project, and I'm sure we're discovering these kinds of issues with it all the time, and it's really useful to hear. So if anyone else has any kind of questions or concerns about the tracker, I would love to hear them, because we want it to be as accurate as possible. Especially as I will talk later, we're kind of developing it and collecting new data. So yeah, asset recovery data, just maybe a quick word on those trends. We do see, yes, of a big increase in 2021, but then partly because of the fact that the increase was so large, it then drops quite a lot over the next 2 years. I guess the problem with looking at the total is that there might be like a really big single case that skews the overall number, which is a big risk. You can slightly mitigate that by looking at the different routes to asset recovery that you can see in the tracker. So from confiscation orders through to forfeiture orders and civil recovery. But Joseph, jump in, please.
At the beginning of the presentation, I believe you quoted someone concerning the potential scope of money laundering in the UK.
Yeah, the National Crime Agency.
And of course, even though the data available for money laundering prosecution and conviction doesn't include the size, I imagine you guys have an idea of what is the size of how much money we're talking about when we look at a prosecution and conviction. So this is a lot of money, but I mean, when we think about the scope of money laundering, and even if we just reduce this to those cases that are actually prosecuted, do you have any kind of like I don't know, feel about what percentage of the actual economic damage or the the financial assets involved are represented here as total assets recovered?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, a very kind of back of the envelope calculation is that the assets recovered in 2020, just the latest year, so 243.3 million, is 0.2% of the 100 billion that the NCA estimates could be laundered through the UK. So it's a really small proportion. But you know what I would love to see, if in money laundering cases, the prosecuting authorities or the court could collect the amount of money that was in question, that was alleged to have been laundered, and then use that to calculate this a kind of more accurate figure. Because the problem with the NCA figure is that no one knows how they came up with it, or if it's actually based on hard data, or if it's just a something someone made up in a lift. And it might have more basis on some data that they don't feel able to release due to kind of national security concerns. But there's no transparency about it, so it's hard to say.
I guess by necessity, it will always be a small percentage of the total landscape of money laundering, because and with very often not sufficient human resources and organizational resources in general to prosecute all the culprits or all the people involved and all the cases, they have to prioritize the bigger fishes, right? And those more likely to allow public officials to recover some of that money. But so even moving away from that estimated 100 billion, that in other areas of corruption measurement, people have also, like the World Bank, have thrown around this idea of $2 trillion or whatever amount, right? And nobody knows actually where those numbers come from. If we were to just look at the assets involved in the cases actually prosecuted, do you have any, again, estimate of what that size would be and how that would compare to this?
No, but I would really like to. That sounds really interesting. It's not data that I'm not aware of the government collecting that data, so it would require an NGO such as ourselves to go and kind of try and find it, and do like a review of available cases, which could be done. Maybe, that could be something that we could put on our list, our to-do list. It would be a big job, and also probably the biggest challenge with that is we have quite a serious problem with justice not being very transparent in the UK. So although we do have this court monitoring program, which allows us to go in, sit in on cases and try and collect documents, we often have really big issues in actually accessing court documents. Sometimes we get them free because we're a charity and an NGO, but sometimes we're charged and they're really expensive. So it's not sustainable to collect loads of them. So that would probably be another big challenge, but it would be so interesting to get that kind of data.
Yeah, I mean that if anything, if nothing else, that gives us an idea of the challenges that they still exist in terms of this type of efforts for the anti-corruption community in the UK, and hopefully not dispiriting anyone, because again, if these are the challenges in the UK, we can only imagine what are the challenges in many other parts of the world, especially in the global south, right? Quality of data being a common issue pretty much everywhere. Yeah, but thank you for that. I mean, for me, it's very informative to get that type of, honest and candid answer. So I really appreciate it.
Great, no worries. So I will continue with the presentation, but yeah, again, please, anyone do jump in if you've got any questions. Yeah, the final thing we look at is anti-money laundering fines, which they're imposed by these supervisors that I mentioned to when David asked his question at the start. The anti-money laundering supervisors, which are these 22 professional bodies which supervise the accountants and lawyers, HMRC, which is the kind of tax authority, the Financial Conduct Authority, which supervises the banking sector and other financial institutions, and the Gambling Commission, which supervises gambling companies. So yeah, it's kind of, again, like a varied picture. There were loads of fines in 2021, similar actually to the assets recovered. It was a big year, but then they've plunged in the last year. Although actually, if you go on the tracker and look at the actual number of fines, they've gone up. So there are more fines, but for much less money, basically. And I think in 2021/2, one of the reasons was that there were a couple of really big fines, which kind of skewed the overall stats. But I will talk about ambitions to add more data on anti-money laundering supervision soon. But yeah, Joseph, come in, please.
I wonder if there's also data on assets frozen, or orders from the government to freeze some assets.
Yes, there is data on that, which so we've got asset recovery data. We only looked at data where the assets have actually been recovered. But if you go into the asset recovery statistical bulletin that is published by the Home Office, they do include data on things like account freezing orders, which we chose not to include just because there's already quite a lot of data in there, so we didn't want to overload it. You can go and look at that. That's quite easy to view on the kind of Excel spreadsheet that the Home Office publishes. But that is something we could, if the public and academia considered that would be really useful to see how many assets have been frozen as well as actually recovered. We could definitely consider including that in a future iteration of the tracker. Beatrice, did you want to come in?
Yes, I would like to ask if there's some data on the amount of suspicious activity reports from these financial institutions first, because I know that sometimes these numbers are taken into consideration in order to calculate what's the amount of money laundered, approximately, of course, because we cannot have a fixed number. And also, what's the level of work between what the courts work and the information that has the UK Financial Intelligence Unit? They work together, or if there's more information from other sources? Because, well, at least in Peru, almost everything comes from most formal cases. The information is taken from all these SARs being sent. Thank you.
Yes, great question. There is data on SARs published by the UK Financial Intelligence Unit. They publish, off the top of my head, they definitely publish the overall number of SARs that have been received in each financial year. Or I'm not sure if they do it by financial year or by annual, sort of January to January, but yeah, in a year. Whether they do it from, I'd have to double check, but I think they might break it down by sector as well. So that's a really good point. That SARS data is definitely something we could include in a future version of the tracker. I guess, it's kind of hard to use that data to estimate the amount of money that is being laundered because there's no amount attached to the SAR. You just know that there's been a SAR. So that could be tricky. But I know that in the last year, I think there were 900,000 SARs received by the UK FIU, which is a lot for an organisation of it's definitely less than 200 people. I think it's 100 and maybe between 150 and 200. I don't remember the exact number of people that were there, but I don't know, you could do a calculation of how many SARs each person is needing to process. It would be a lot, way too many for any person to do in a year. So the SAR system is definitely one that needs to be kind of looked at. I've kind of touched on where the data comes from. But these are the three main sources. The Ministry of Justice publishes the criminal justice statistics every quarter. The Home Office publishes the asset recovery stats, and the Treasury publishes a report on anti-money laundering supervision, which is where we get that fining data from. But I see David has another question, please.
Oh, okay. I just want to find out whether you also track the personality involved in some of these cases. Are they politically exposed persons, or they are businesses or individuals?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And where have I got? Challenge number one, challenge number two. There we go. Challenge number 4. There is no data on individual cases in the tracker, which is it's a flaw of the tracker, but it's kind of in the way we've collected the data. There's no the data just relates to the kind of macro stats. There's no individual cases articulated within the data. Obviously, we as an anti-corruption organization that track court cases in the courts have lots of data on individual cases that we collect through court documents and sort of just listening into what's going on in the court. And we do publish details of those cases on our website. So that we try and track a lot of the major corruption-related cases in the UK. So, for example, I mentioned Glencore. If you go on our website and type in Glencore, we've got quite a lot of information on that case. We do case studies on particularly kind of significant cases. So there was a big one relating to Mozambique called the tuna bond scandal that people might have come across, and we did a big case study on that one, for example. But in the actual tracker, there is no individual data. But I would love to think of a way of somehow, maybe attaching some interesting cases to it.
Yes, as a follow-up question, if is there given that most of these cases are kind of transnational in nature, right? So do you kind of track the kind of geopolitical spread of the cases?
We don't. I mean, we do in terms of in terms of what the individual cases that we track. Obviously, we very much track the transnational nature of those. There and they very often do have an international element. So one of the units that we track the work of really closely is the International Anti-Corruption Unit in the National Crime Agency, and they have they only take cases that relate to countries which receive overseas development aid from the UK. So they will always have a very strong international element. And they recently announced a case in relation to Malawi, for example, and a British businessman who's alleged to have paid bribes in Malawi, although that case is very much in its early stages. So there is definitely a transnational element, but in terms of the data, the government data we're using, there's no. I think there is. I think recently, actually, the government announced a policy change where they were going to specify the nationality of the defendant, which we could think about including. But that's new. That's not. I don't think that's in the previous versions of the data, so that'd have to be a new consideration for future developments of the tracker.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, Joseph, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something to the discussion that you just had with David about identification of individual cases. And of course, a separate question is if this is something that Spotlight on Corruption would like to kind of try, right? Because the purposes, as I believe there was the point of one of the questions early on about what are the goals for this type of exercises and tools, right? Either to identify the size of enforcement, for statistical purposes, for policy design, et cetera, advocacy, or actually be able to identify individual cases for other types of advocacy and as it is called, a naming and shaming strategy. But as an example, I thought the design of this platform that you referred to earlier, this Where the Bribes Are by the Means Group, right? that where you can hover over one of the countries, and then you get the kind of like the names of the actors that were fined, and depending on the size of the fine, you also have their icons larger or smaller, right? So I don't know. I just wanted to drop that as a possibility or as an idea of how to represent that level of individual cases data or information if you wanted to go that direction.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I like them. I like what the Minter group has done there. I think it's pretty smart because they do enable a connection between the macro data on FCPA and the kind of more individual cases. So yeah, very good point. So let me go back. Yeah, just a quick word on. I thought I'd just flag that it definitely was not me that did all of the nifty data visualizations. I do not have those skills, unfortunately. But it was a consultant who we engaged called Glyn Mottershead, who did a brilliant job and kind of used D3 JavaScript to do the data visualizations. Obviously, we were kind of working very closely together to work out exactly how they should look and which data to visualize. But yeah, in terms of the technical skills, that was brought in by Glyn. So I thought I should definitely mention him. So a few challenges. I mentioned one of them already, but it might have been a bit confusing because I mentioned it in passing, and it took me a while to get my head around. But basically, in the UK, the Ministry of Justice collects prosecution and conviction data in two distinct ways that result in quite different data sets. So the first way is that they only collect prosecutions and convictions for the most serious offence that has been prosecuted. So they define that in various ways, but like, for example, if it's got the highest statutory penalty compared to the other cases, other offences that it's been prosecuted alongside, they will just use that specific offence. So that's called principal offence data. And then there's also non-principal offence data, which is the other way that the offences are counted, which is they will just count all of the offences that were prosecuted in a particular case and just throw all those into the data. So for money laundering, for example, we've collected both and visualized both ways of collecting that data. So we've got cases where money laundering is the most serious case prosecuted. So often it will be like a standalone money laundering case where that's been the focus of the prosecution. We've also collected it where money laundering will have just been attached to a more serious case. So, for example, it might be a really serious drugs trafficking case, which involved some money laundering, and the money laundering will have been attached onto that prosecution as like an extra bit. We visualized both because we're probably mostly interested in cases where money laundering was the most serious offence, because those are more likely to cover a case of grand corruption, for example, where really serious money laundering has occurred, and that's the main piece of legislation that's being used to target that particular offending, whereas the stats where it included both the principal and non-principal offences would be more likely to be where money laundering is attached to a crime that isn't necessarily anything to do with corruption. But that is, it's a bit complicated, and there are various reasons kind of why that's been done. But I won't go into them in too much depth now. Conviction rates I mentioned. So we can't calculate conviction rates because the prosecutions take more than 1 year often. I kind of mentioned this throughout, but how much of this data really relates to corruption is a question that has to be asked. Obviously, some of it is obviously only related to corruption, like the bribery stats in particular. Misconduct in public office, I mentioned, can be related to corruption. Sometimes it's not so directly. The money laundering, obviously, only a small proportion of those cases are going to actually be related to corruption. A lot of them will be related to other forms of acquisitive crime. The asset recovery data, those criminal assets will have been recovered off the back of plenty of other crimes, not just corruption, although the government has done a good job in showing where those cases related to grand corruption. Yeah, I've covered that one. No data on individual cases, although we obviously do look at that in other parts of our work. Joseph, please jump in.
I had a question about the previous challenge. So in the platform, right? So you give some options for the user to visualize the data, and specifically, well, just thinking about the money laundering and the bribes, conviction and prosecutions. You give the option to select between individuals and corporations, right? The entity's target. I wonder if the information allows to potentially also subdivide if you wanted to between individuals in the private sector and individuals in the public sector.
It doesn't. No.
Oh.
But that would be great. But it just has individuals. And actually, a caveat which is in the methodology on our site, is that the corporate prosecutions actually also include public bodies. So if a public body was found guilty of an offence, then that would also be included. But in general, that doesn't happen very often. So we've just called it corporate offences as a kind of shorthand.
Is this an issue with the classification that the public agency producing the data, engage in, or is it a matter that those details are there, or maybe are not there at all? So,
well, some of the offences, like misconduct in public office, everyone there will be a public office holder, because you can't be prosecuted under that offence if you're not a public office holder. And some of them, like in the bribery stats, there's bribery of a foreign public official. So that's obviously going to have to be an official. That has, well, we actually were talking to one of the prosecutorial authorities about this, and they say there has been one now. But nevertheless, it's a bit of a nuanced question, because the occasion where that actually occurred was a really interesting conviction of the former chief of staff to the Madagascan president, who was caught in a sting operation requesting a bribe from a mining multinational in London by an undercover operation by the NCA. But she had been requesting a bribe in her capacity as a foreign public official. So but she wasn't actually offered one by in reality, because it was a sting operation. So there's never technically been a conviction of bribery of a foreign public official, because she wasn't bribed, but she did request a bribe. So that's kind of the claim, that counts as a foreign public official being bribed. But it's a bit of a nuanced question, I would say. But then other things like the money laundering cases, we have no idea if they're public officials or not. And I don't know, I would be quite surprised if that data is collected at all, but I don't know for sure.
Great, thank you. I mean, again, unfortunate, but again, it gives us some ideas about what would be the next challenges if there was a momentum for improvement here.
Yeah, exactly. And that is another thing, like one of the aims of this is not only to kind of show what policy solutions could be made in response to the data, and to kind of use it as an advocacy tool to argue for greater resourcing of these agencies, because we see that the results do seem to be improving when more resourcing is put in, but only by a small amount, and therefore we should be calling for more. But also to encourage the government to collect more data and kind of collect more useful data. So we've been, for example, pushing for a long time for data on high-end money laundering to be published, which that data was collected when the UK was reviewed by the Financial Action Task Force in 2017/18, and it was in the mutual evaluation report, but it's never been published since then. We aren't sure if it's been collected or not. But yeah, I just accidentally went off the presentation. Okay, I will continue with my challenges. Trends can be really misleading. That's something we should be upfront about. So even if, like for example, the fraud cases, the overall fraud cases were plummeting, as you'll have seen in the screenshot I shared. But someone who used to work for the Crown Prosecution Service pointed out that the actual prosecution strategy changed at some point a few years ago, so that they were going after more high value fraud cases, but fewer, more high value, but fewer. So the just because there are fewer prosecutions doesn't necessarily mean that they're less impactful. Like you might be going after 100 petty criminals or one like massive corporate fraudster, and the impact of the latter case might be much greater than just going after the petty fraudsters. Ideally, you just go after everyone who's committed a crime, but the kind of reality of under-resourced agencies means that that's not necessarily going to be possible. Same with some of the AML data and asset recovery data. So there might be like a really good year where there have been loads of assets recovered, but that might just be because there was one massive case. There might also be like a case where the actual assets recovered were quite low, but the impact was really large because it involved, I don't know, like the conviction of 10 key figures in an organized crime gang, but maybe they were better at hiding their assets because of their experience in using offshore jurisdictions and that kind of thing. Whereas a really big recovery might occur because a police officer just happened to stop a car that was speeding, and there just happened to be £20 million in the boot, and that would be great. That would go into the stats, but would it be that impactful? Maybe not as impactful as the kind of lower recovery that involved conviction of some organized crime figures. But yeah, Joseph, please jump in.
Yes, no, I don't have a question, just a comment here, because I found that point. I mean, among many other very insightful points that you have already presented, that really made me think, because this idea of reflecting not just the number of convictions or how much money was recovered, but how many people were involved in those cases, and how many people were found guilty and punished, right? Because especially nowadays that we recognize that corruption, especially the most significant types of corruption, are network affairs, right? This is not a one individual asking for a bribe or paying a bribe. These are individuals who are embedded within very complex networks. So potentially being able to prosecute a number of individuals within the same network where it has a lot more impact, right? And the capacity of that network of continue functioning the way that it had been doing for the previous years, instead of just going, even if you go for the head, just if it's one individual. I mean, what is the serious challenge that represents for the network as a whole? So I thought that could also be very interesting data to look at, right? Yeah, so I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. And it just kind of shows that while this macro data is quite useful and interesting in some ways, it definitely needs to be complemented by some quantitative like analysis of actual individual cases, as David kind of helpfully pointed out. We're kind of looking at the overall national statistics across every single agency that is involved in prosecutions and asset recovery. So we haven't looked at the specific performance of key agencies. We thought about doing that, and we still might do that, but it has some difficulties because it can really end up being quite misrepresentative. So the NCA, for example, is like 10 times bigger than the SFO, or maybe even more, way bigger, and they therefore have way more cases. The SFO has fewer cases, but they're very complex and high impact in theory. And it might lead, if people were looking at that from an uninformed perspective, they would say, oh, well, the SFO has 10 cases, but the NCA has 100. Why don't we just get rid of the SFO or something, which is obviously not what we want, because they're a really important actor and enforcement agency in this space. So we're a bit wary of doing that, but we are planning to do, and I've got future plans, looking at kind of the resourcing of agencies. So looking at their budgets and how many staff work there. And there are some interesting surveys done by the civil service survey on sort of staff morale, so how people feel in that workplace and how they're getting on. And then the final challenge, which I think are probably best just to show my screen. I've got the spreadsheet up here. Can you see the Excel spreadsheet here? Great. So yeah, this is the latest Ministry of Justice criminal justice statistic. I'm on an Apple Mac computer, so if I try and go, and here you can filter by offense type, offense code, etc. However, because I'm on an Apple Mac and Excel doesn't work very well on Apple, if I try and go into the pivot tables and use them, I get this message, which is the data model features are not supported on this version of Excel, which means that anyone on an Apple computer is not able to actually analyze any of this data. You have to use a Microsoft or other computer. Luckily, I've got this is my work laptop, but I've got a kind of personal Microsoft one that I used to access the data. But it's quite old and it's very slow. So it actually took me a lot longer than it would have done otherwise. So that's really annoying. I don't really know. It's not really the government's fault because it's Microsoft Excel doesn't want Apple to be able to use it to the same extent that it can be used for Microsoft users, but it's really annoying. And actually, while I'm here, I can also show you what the asset recovery spreadsheet looks like, which if anyone's interested. So this is the homepage, and it's got 16 tabs. It goes into quite some detail. So we've got kind of the total value of process of crime recovered, and then all sorts of different asset recovery types. Here we haven't actually visualized this, but it might be a bit small. But can I zoom in? Here we go. Yeah, so here you've got the offense type and the value of proceeds of crime that have been recovered from that type. So we've got fraud, money laundering, drugs, modern slavery, theft, and other. Nothing on grand corruption in this section, but that's quite interesting. And there is, I'll try and find the section on grand corruption, which we do visualize in the tracker, but it's interesting to see the raw data as well. There we go, so the last tab. So here we've got the value of proceeds of corruption denied, recovered, and returned to foreign states. Fairly small numbers apart from in these 2 years, which are, there you go. But there are specific reasons for that. One of them was quite a controversial recovery that ended up just going back to a businessman in Pakistan to pay his court fees. So it wasn't a particularly good asset return in that case. But yeah, I think I will. Oh, it's 11:30 exactly, so I'll call it a day there. Unless anyone has any final quick questions before I close. But thank you very much for listening and allowing me to present our work.
Thank you, James. I mean, it was really fantastic, and not just in terms of getting to know the work of Spotlight on corruption and being able to go in detail through the tracker, but also in how insightful this discussion about both the potential of the data available, the uses of it, but also the challenges that remain. But the opportunities, right, of having better quality data, what we could potentially do with it as academicians and as advocacy groups, as policymakers, etc., etc. So thank you so much for this. It was fantastic. Unless anybody has a question for James, a last comment or anything of the sort, then I think we can. Alice, please go ahead.
Yeah, it's really quick. So I just can you ask you, James, you can share with us maybe in the chat an email contact to reach out and maybe discuss more these challenges that you are just list and also maybe discuss other challenges, how, for example, the kind of users that you have in mind that could potentially use the tracker, like citizens or maybe journalists or other researchers. And yeah. Thank you.
Absolutely, yeah. I've put my email in the chat, and I would really
Thank you
encourage
so
everyone
much.
to get in touch. And just to say, I meant to say at the start that we're always really keen to collaborate with academia, both in terms of research, or we've acted as impact partners before for academics whose research they want to try and promote and get greater impact on in policy circles. So please do get in touch. And yeah, thanks very much for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you again, James. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. I know for some of you may already be lunchtime, so I don't want to take more of your time. Thank you again, everyone. James, for wonderful presentation. I hope we stay in touch. And yeah, please stay tuned for the announcement of the next roundtable in July. It's potentially coming with a little bit of a surprise, so I'll be sharing the email with all of you once it's time. And that's it from my side. Have a lovely day, afternoon, evening, everyone. Thank you.